Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Tallman, the Poetry Ambassador for Miami-Dade County and an Associate Editor with South Florida Poetry Journal. And today I have the honor of talking to Victoria Chang about her new book, The Trees Witness Everything, which was published by Copper Canyon Press in April of this year. Just to give you a quick overview, I'm going to read the text from the back cover here. In The Trees Witness Everything, Victoria Chang reinvigorates language by concentrating it, using constraint to illuminate and free the wild interior. Largely composed in various Japanese syllabic forms called wakas, each poem is shaped by pattern and count. This highly original work innovates inside the lineage of great poets, including W.S. Merwin, whose poem titles are repurposed as frames and mirrors for the text, stitching past and present in complex dialogue. Chang depicts the smooth, melancholic isolation of the mind while reaching outward to name with reverence, economy, and whimsy the ache of wanting, the hawk in its shadow, our human urge to hide the minute beneath the light. Welcome, Victoria. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Could you tell our audience where you're joining us from today?
I am zooming in from LA, Los Angeles.
Okay. And you'll be participating in Miami Book Fair this year with your sixth poetry collection, right? Are my numbers right? The sixth?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And how many times have you attended Book Fair?
I've never been, I don't think. I think I've only been to Miami once when it was at AWP was there. So
Oh, okay.
it wasn't that long ago, I guess. But yeah, no, I've not been to the book fair before.
Okay, well, I think you're going to be in for a treat. And you are going to be presenting, I'm looking at my schedule now. It looks like you're on the 19th, Saturday the 19th at noon with Peter Balakian, John Freeman, and Victoria Riddell on this panel called Redemption, Refuge, and Release.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
Write that down. Okay.
Now you know where you're going.
Now I know where I'm going.
So let's start off by having you read a little bit. Would you mind? I don't know if you're open to requests or not. Let me ask you
I'll
that.
read whatever you want me to. I don't really care. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, some people have sensitivities, so I want to ask that. I would love to hear you read When You Go Away on page 10.
Okay. When you go away. I look at my hands, watch how they bend just like air, can sit still like ice, the small lines at the knuckles, how they can drag hair or cover a woman's mouth. I should have kept the ashes of her hands to see whether they could still be held.
Wow, that one gets me every time. So beautiful. Um, can you talk to us a little bit about the Waka form that you use in, I think it's mostly in parts 1 and 3 of this book, yes?
Mhm.
And what led you to choose that particular form?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I, wrote my prior book, Obit, I mean, this is in retrospect, clearly, that it's very subject matter heavy for obvious reasons. It's really exploring, very complicated emotions related to grief. And I thought it might be fun just to, I had written tankas, little tankas in there. So the 57577 syllable form in that book already. And so it was kind of already on my mind. And I have this tendency to sort of, like, I don't think of books. I just write, kind of thing. And so inevitably things are always overlapping. So I would say those little tankas overlapped with my desires to keep writing small, tiny miniature poems. But I didn't want to keep writing tankas. And then I just started looking around, and I mean, obviously we all know what the haiku is. But when I started looking around, I learned that there are all these other syllabic forms. And there were different 5s and 7s and syllabic patterns. I thought, well, that sounds fun. And then I think I was just looking at W.S. Merwin's poems. Like, I just kind of sometimes I think at that point that book was sitting on my desk, and I get a lot of those books because of Copper Canyon. They just send me like like there's a selected, there's a collected, there's, there's like a selected of the collected. I mean, it's like a, constantly publishing very different mutations of his poems. I have so many of his books, and I just loved the titles. They just made me smile. I just found them. I was like, I would never name my poems these titles. I just like Walkers or Lark or How It Happens, The Sound of Light, The String. It's just not me. And so the more it wasn't me, and the more that my poems are not like Merwin's, I thought that would be fun to have double constraints. And so that's how these poems came about. And it really was like it's more like a prompt, because I think when you write a poem, you're just sitting around, usually just whatever comes to your mind. But this was very much so, okay, I'm going to pick a random title and I'm going to pick a random pattern and just mess around and see what happens. And so that's how this whole sort of thing came about. But I didn't really know how many I was going to write. I didn't really have a plan, if that makes sense, even though it oftentimes seems like I do. I didn't have one, but it was joyful. It was very fun to write these poems. And they're written right in the middle of the pandemic too. So yeah, I have fond memories of working on these.
I love Merwin as well, and I especially love the poem Rain Light.
Mm-hmm.
And you wrote a poem on page 16 called Rain Light, and I'm wondering if you would read that for our audience.
Sure. Rain Light. When the mothers leave, what are we supposed to do? I have rented light, but all that's left is a searchlight shining in the wrong country. What happens to those raindrops now that someone has seen them?
So you dedicated The Trees Witness Everything to Merwin. I'm wondering what your specific connection to this particular poet is, if you don't mind sharing that.
I don't really have any connection to Merwin. It really is very random. I oftentimes when I was younger would read books of poetry or poets that I was supposed to love. And being kind of I'm a person that just goes my own way. And a lot of times I just didn't like some of the stuff that I read. And Merwin, I didn't quite understand Merwin when I was younger. And but I love Merwin now. So I think maybe like loving a poet in my sort of older years, my more senior years, I was interested in paying, homage or homage, or I'm not actually sure how to pronounce that. And is it homage or?
I think it depends. I've heard homage and I've heard homage is more French, right?
Yeah, but I think that I just have been I was reading more of Merwin, and I had read the entire book. There are so many poets I can point to that I read when I was younger, when other teachers or other, older teachers usually were like, oh, read this or read this. And I was like, I don't really like it that much, but I never really write anything off because I know that maybe it's me that I could not be ready for it. And sometimes I just never end up being ready for it, if that makes sense. So I think my relationship with Merwin has been very fluid, and I love the poems now. I can really embody them more so now at this age, and just being older and having more life experiences.
So I thought it was interesting. There was a poem called September, October, December, but there was no November. Was that a conscious choice?
No, I just sort of, I literally took his books and I started checking off the titles that I used, but sometimes being just sort of, I mean, sloppy and airhead, I may have forgotten to check things off. So sometimes I know there are probably like doubles in here. I never went back to look, if that makes sense. Whatever kind of caught my eye, I just kind of said, oh, I feel like writing, and then I just kind of let my mind just wander. And like if you have a title called, I don't know, Beginners, I just saw one. I just like, what is that? I don't know, like beginners, and just whatever happens to come to your mind comes to your mind. And then you sit there and start counting your fingers to get the syllables to work, which was also a bit of a nightmare. But yeah, I mean, I think that I was up for the challenge. I think it's really difficult to write small poems. that was also the challenge. It's like, I think all poems are difficult, can be difficult to write. I mean, some come to people immediately, right? But I think for the most part, writing poems has its challenges. And the tiny poem and there have been more tiny poems, miniature poems throughout the last maybe 5 or 10 years because of, Instagram. And so I was like, gosh, it just proved to me every time I saw one, I was like, oh yeah, miniature poems are hard to write because sometimes people would post stuff, you're like, ooh, yeah, that's so cliched or something like that. And so I was always up for the challenge, and when people say things or when things seem challenging, I'm always gonna give it a try and see how it goes and not really care about the result, if that makes sense. It's, for me, it was all about the process of trying these and having a good time.
So on page 30, that's the first time I saw a reference to the trees witness everything. It's in the last line of In the Open, you write, trees witness everything, but they don't always look away. I'm curious I guess I'm just curious in general about the origin of the title of your book. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't remember. Yeah, I have no recollection of how that title came about. I probably picked it from this poem. But I change titles all the time. Like, I'm working on something now. I've changed that title. Oh, yeah. It's on its third title. Yeah. So it's now, this thing I'm working on is it was titled Eureka, and now it's titled Trees of Knowledge. So it just keeps changing. I'm sure it won't be the last thing. And yeah, I'll just constantly be fiddling around with things.
I always like to ask poets that because I don't know if poets come up with their book titles themselves or someone else suggested, or that's the reason why I asked, because when I was working on my first book, I had this title in mind and I ran it by a friend and my friend said, that's terrible. Why don't you call it this instead? And it was a really good suggestion. So I was just curious if you kind of sat out, had this idea in mind that you were going to write this book called The Trees Witness Everything, or if it came later, or if someone else chose it for you. I was just curious what the process was, but it's okay if you don't remember.
Yeah, mostly I think that I just sort of, it just pops into my head. But I have heard a lot of poets say that they really struggle with titles, and I just don't understand why. She just said this in a class I visited at Sonoma State, and I said, my gosh, titles are so easy. Like, if you let go your kind of, I don't know, this idea of perfection, it's so easy. Like, you pick any poem, like, When the Mothers Leave, that could be that's the first line, that could be the title. I mean, it could be mothers, like, you could pick a word out of that first line. It could be untitled, it could be your title. You can look in the rest of the poem, and just look for something, what happens to those raindrops? What happens could be your title. Those raindrops could be your title. I don't know. I just don't think I don't really think it's or worst comes to worst, you could just call your poem title, just title it Self-Portrait or Elegy, or I don't know. It just doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal to me. And so, but people say that all the time. They say they struggle so much with titles. And I was like, why? It's like the least of your problems.
I think that poem titles are easy, but book titles are a little bit harder. I feel like there's a lot of pressure to really nail the actual book title.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are other issues, right? Because I mean, it's always good to Google a title and make sure if there's another book that's named that, to understand what's out there, and then also to think about it. There could be problems with that. I mean, I had a friend who was really into what the spine looked like, how your title would look on the spine and things like that. But yeah, I definitely think that the book title is important, but is it memorable? Does it have to be memorable? I mean, Catherine Barnett's first book was Into Such, I don't know, Into Such Perfect Spheres, Some Holes Are Pierced, right? It's like a really long, unwieldy title. I can't remember the book title at all, but I certainly remember the poems. To me, that's all that matters, the poems.
Hmm. So I especially enjoyed the commentary on poets and poetry throughout the book as well. There are quite a few of these, the late wonders, lives of the artists, the first watchers on 32 and 33, it is March, the master, the arrival, dusk and winter, going, river, sound, remembered. All of these make reference to poems and poetry. And I don't want to necessarily call it criticism, maybe just
Uh-huh.
observation. But I'd like
I
you to
love
talk.
to poke fun at poets.
Well, yeah, okay, that is sort of what it seemed like. So I didn't want to call it out that way, but that's what it felt like. So I was kind of curious about your decision to weave that into this book.
I don't think for me poems involve decisions. I think they just show what you're thinking about, whether you want to let yourself and your thoughts come out or not. I mean, certainly I just write whatever I feel like it, and then later I will cut out entire poems, or I'll delete things, or I'll change things. And so my decision to keep, is what I would say, these poems in here was just really a little bit playful. I think poets are very unique people. I think yeah, and in my recent sort of position as the New York Times Poetry Magazine editor, I've had the privilege and joy and also hilarious window into the desires of poets in ways that I hadn't before. And I think that those, and just also I had edited the Poem a Day a little while back, and it is just, you kind of learn about human nature when you're in doing those kinds of projects, and how people contact you, the ways in which they contact you. You've also had the opportunity to see how people behave on social media, and then also maybe I've met some new friends over the last maybe 5 years or so. It's like talk to them a lot about poetry and like what people want, and that's been really insightful to me, because I've learned a lot about poets, and I think poets are very funny, sometimes very honest and very revealing in their desires. And I thought I'd be fun to poke fun at that. Us, we are all poets. Us, poke fun at us.
I wasn't expecting to laugh out loud. I really wasn't when I read this book, because I think it's because I've read all of your books, but Obit is, it's heavy. You don't laugh so much when you're reading Obit or Dear Memory, but this one I laughed out loud.
What
So
did you think was funny? I'm curious. What did you laugh at?
I was laughing at how you were poking fun of poets for being obsessed with fame, for example. I just laugh out loud because the observations are they're spot on, but a lot of people don't want to say these things out loud necessarily. Yeah, I thought it was funny how yeah, you were just kind of poking fun of poets and in sort of a playful way in the middle of grief. Right? So it's like that's why it was fun. I like the balance that you struck in this book.
Well, I think some people would say, I think this book and a lot of things that I write are examples of having conviction for your own, whatever it is, your own vision or whatever it is you're working on. Because I do think that, yeah, I mean, people can always criticize your work and the choices that you make. And, one of which is don't talk about the poets, right? Or one that I heard before, which is like, that's too insular. Nobody else would care. And then other things, it's like, why write a book of miniature poems? Why use syllabics? Why use W.S. Merwin's titles? Why is this book so melancholy? I've heard it all. And before, during, and not so much during, because I was drafting these and I don't show them to anybody, but certainly after, if you release a book in the world, you see how people will have quibbles with everything. And at the end of the day, I think this book is a great example of just like, I don't care. Just do what you feel like doing. And I am both a very sort of thoughtful and philosophical and sometimes very melancholy person, related to my childhood and being of the Asian diaspora, grew up in a different kind of family. So I have those feelings, but then I also am constantly making jokes. And I think I love humor. And I think that whoever you are, or however you are as a person shows through in your writing. And so I think it's important to stay true to yourself, knowing that whatever you write is not going to connect with everyone, because not everyone likes you, right, as a human being. So as nice as you seem, I'm sure you have people that don't like you. And so I feel when we're writing poems, it's like we're putting ourselves on the page, and in a very sort of undeveloped way. And so I think that, the whole don't put poets in there, it's too insular, or why are you being kind of, mean or something like that. I was like, you just, I kind of kept them in. I'm sure I actually took out some of the meaner ones.
I think it was overly mean. It was good fun, I think.
I think so. Well, I think it's just, if people don't know anything about poets, they're gonna pass them over. I mean, there are enough in here in my mind that, there's so many. I've never counted, but it's not meant to be read you don't have to read the whole thing. You could just kind of pop around, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, I actually counted them, and it was quite a lot.
Right? Merwin wrote a lot of poems. I'll just put it that way.
Yes. So, how long did it take you to write this book?
I remember it was in 2020, and I think I started before the pandemic started. So it was like January-ish, or February-ish. And then I just worked on them throughout the big part of the pandemic. So definitely, like a while, but not that long. Like, there's only at some point I really didn't want to work on them anymore. So I'm thinking if this book came out in 2022, yeah, I definitely finished it like sometime in 2020, actually. Yeah.
Wow.
2020. But yeah, it's like these days I actually just devote a lot of time to my poems. And so I'm working like on my poems many, 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 many hours a week. And so I just have a little more time, even though I'm really busy. I have a little more my own time now than I did over the last, like 15 years. People always say that I'm really prolific. And I was like, yeah, but it's like I have 6 books of poems. I'm 51, and it's not that many books, but I definitely feel like I'm making up for a little bit of lost time, because for 10 or 15 years, I really didn't write very much, and I hardly read, and I just didn't have any time. So
I really enjoyed your shout out to ketchup and mustard and the acknowledgments, by the
way. Did I? What did I say? Something silly, I'm sure.
I thought it was interesting that of all the members of your family, you just chose the dogs. Thanks to my family in wiener dogs, mustard and ketchup for always supporting me. I love that. That was like
I read these poems aloud. I read my poems aloud now, and I never used to do that. So they're always sitting around, and I feel so bad for them, because I'm reading these aloud over and over and over again, and there they are, like just looking at me. And I think they've heard more poems than any dogs in the history of dogs, because I read them aloud, even the ones I'm working on now, like over and over and over again. So they deserve all the thanks in the world.
Well, if they're sticking around, then they must like it, right?
I don't know. I think they're just waiting for the next treat.
So your book is really rich with symbolism, and being a Michigan-born poet myself, I'm kind of curious how the seasons in particular influence your writing. I feel a lot of the seasons in this book.
Sure. Yeah. I definitely think that Merwin is a very sort of nature-oriented poet. Obviously the lice is more sort of political, but I think, I definitely think that he's titling these poems things like late spring. Like for me, it's like I think about spring, but he thinks about late spring. Another one, It Is March. And then another one is just spring. I'm just looking randomly at the titles here. So Snowfall, right? I think Greenfield, I think that's Merwin's influence more than my own. I'm not at all what I would classify as like a nature poet. I am a bird person, though birds are always and have always been in my poems as visual art. Like I think visual art has always appeared in my poems. So I'm a seeing poet, but I'm not like before like this book, I wouldn't say it's like I'm spending all this time thinking about like trees and things like that. But the thing I'm working on now is all trees. And so I think it just depends on what mood I'm in, and absolutely I grew up in with seasons, and very thick seasons, as you know, and the seasons are here in Los Angeles, even though you may not feel it quite as acutely, but there are red leaves everywhere right now. And so I think it is a part of I also think of seasons as being about time passing more than anything else, cycles.
I see it the same way. Since I've moved to Miami, I feel like I've kind of lost my concept of time because I used to link everything in my memories to certain seasons. And now that it's summer all the time, it's hard almost for me to keep track of time.
Right. Yeah, no, totally. But I think, yeah, I mean, there are other ways. I think the calendar but yes, everything is so cyclical when you really think about it. And I was just in the grocery store, just at Target, like maybe an hour ago, and thinking about how there's just like all the Christmas decorations are there, and all the Thanksgiving stuff is there, and how it just feels like capitalism will remind you when the seasons are coming too.
That's very true. You mentioned being a bird poet. I noticed, I felt like there were a lot more bird references than tree references actually in this book. I mean, there were owls and crows, and I think sparrows and thrush and gulls and wrens, hummingbirds, dodos. It's interesting that you call yourself a bird poet because I remember as I was reading, I was kind of looking for mentions of different trees, and I didn't see so many specific tree mentions. I mean, there were a few, but it was really the birds that I saw that you were really touching on and naming all different sorts. So that thanks for clarifying that for me, because I thought, wow, she does talk about birds an awful lot.
I know. So
Not in a
many
bad way.
birds.
I love birds, but it was interesting to catch that.
Yeah.
Sure. You have four sections in this book, right? And in let's see, the second section is this Marfa, Texas section. And then you end with the section Love Letters. And I was thinking about, I had read this article recently, and someone had basically titled you the poet laureate of grief. I thought, that's kind of an interesting observation, but I kind of also see you as the poet laureate of hope. I mean, you end with these love letters, and in there you say, "Let me tell you a story about hope. It always starts and ends with birds." How do you see yourself and your work, Victoria? Do you see yourself as kind of a poet of hope in addition to maybe grief? Or, I mean, if you had to define yourself, I don't really like to put people in boxes, but I'm just kind of curious how you see yourself.
I actually see myself as someone who just is very experimental and joyful in the process of poetry. I think I just like to try new things, and I like to mess around with form. I think the critics will tend to, that's their job, our job. I write criticism too, but it's like our job to kind of like label people and try to like define things. And so I definitely think that we do that. Like, I think of Carolyn Forche as being like a war poet, right? And I mean, certainly she's not only a war poet, but, I think that, or political poet, I guess maybe is a better way to say it. And so, I think we tend to do that, but I definitely think, I have written about grief quite a bit because it's, like my parents were both so sick for so long. And that's a very unique experience. And then again, like, I'm an immigrant's child. And so I've written about what it means to be, to not have any information, in dear memory, this sort of like hybrid book. And so that is a different kind of grief. And so I think I have, absolutely. But if people read earlier, like my first and second books were about Asian American identity. And then also I wrote a lot about historical and political atrocities. And so I definitely think I'm kind of really all over the place. And if anything, I think it shows my very horizontal interests. Like I'm interested in so many things. And I think that just shows in my writing. But I do think the last bunch of books, that I have published are definitely exploring these areas because, my parents were sick for, oh gosh, like decades. And so like, it's such a big chunk of my own life. I'm not that old. And my mom passed away in 2015. My dad passed away in 2022. And so I do think that it's just a big part of my life. And yeah, I don't really think of it as anything more as just being, what we're particularly going through in our lives. And so yeah, my dad just passed away. So I think that there's a long poem I wrote related to that in my forthcoming book on ekphrastic poems is coming out in 2024. So I've been writing a lot and yeah, exploring those themes because it's still a big part of my life.
Is there anything that you want to touch on that I didn't ask you about before I ask you to close with reading some more of your work for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that no, there's nothing. You did a great job. But I just started thinking about, I wrote this talk because I was wondering what the poetry of joy means. Like, what does joy mean? And I think for me, like when you ask me, are you a poet of grief or are you a poet of hope? I think the two are totally intertwined. They're either braided or they're this, different sides of the same coin kind of thing. One cannot exist without the other. And I did a lot of research and I thought really hard about this. And I think that one really you cannot have the joyful feelings without a deep understanding of what sadness and grief are. And so I think I do both. I think I'm human, and I think therefore whatever it is I feel at any particular time will come out in the poems, and I think they're related. So yeah, I like to think that I'm a poet of like sort of the human condition, and I think that joy and hope are both a part of that very intimately. And I think that's what and also I'm writing some poems now, just sort of like exploring those ideas too. Yeah. But no, I think you did a great job.
Oh, well, thank you. I wanted to give you an opportunity to say something about the book if you wanted to that I hadn't said, but I think it would be great if you could close us out by reading poems of your choice. Whatever you feel like reading for us would be an honor to hear.
Sure. Let's see. I'll just read some things that I might read sometimes. I don't actually, I think I've marked some of the pages, but maybe I haven't. I'm so disorganized. I know I have like
you take your time.
Yeah, I'll just read a few. I'll just read a couple that I marked off here. Little soul. I rode on your back until your knees broke, and now 1 mile left, I must toss you. Turning. My mother is dead. The lemons still turn yellow. The trout still stare emptily. Desire is still free. We still love many people, eat peaches as if kissing. Maybe I'll read. How many more? How many do you want me to read? Give me a number.
You have another turning too, don't you? Don't you have two poems called Turning? One about red leaves. Yes, on page 107. That's your other turning.
Yeah, I can read that one. What is that one? Turning. Yeah, see, that's an example of not having checked off that title. In the fall, there are so many choices, red and more red. Anything not red seems wrong. Let me tell you about green, how it's really a spy hiding under its garment of red, how it closes distances, taking notes on how to leave. Maybe I'll read one more.
I actually like the repetition of poem titles in books. I feel like I was seeing a friend I saw at one part over again. It's like a little reunion.
Uh-huh. No, it's true. Yeah. Actually, the poet Oliver de la Paz and I were talking about how he called himself a pattern maker. He likes to write in groupings and series. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's good. I was like, I'm just really obsessive. And so I like to turn the same thing over like 12 times. But I'll read this last one, The Lovers. There is a wildfire starving on top of a lake. See how the water holds fire but cannot end it? We insist on love when all we want is mercy.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for spending this time with us. And I encourage everyone who's watching to pick up a copy of The Trees Witness Everything if you don't already have one, and you can do that at Books and Books, Miami's local independent bookstore, while you're here at the book fair, or online at booksandbooks.com. Please buy local when you can, and continue to support poets. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and have a good night or a good day wherever you are watching from today.
Thank you.